You're listening to Serial Killer Files, powered quietly in the background by the folks at Scoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan. Today's case. It's the kind that keeps coming up in our Scoob research threads. A story that feels like fiction until you realize every horrifying detail is real. A man who wore the badge until he decided he'd write his own law. Extras and deeper breakdowns are in the description. Let's dive in. This is the story of Manuel Pardo Jr., a former police officer turned vigilante killer known in criminal circles as the real-life Dexter. But unlike the fictional character who captured our imaginations, Pardo's reign of terror was all too real, leaving 9 people dead and a community forever changed. Born on September 26, 1956, in the sun-soaked state of Florida, Manuel Pardo Jr. entered a world of privilege and possibility. His father, Manuel Pardo Sr., was a successful businessman and prominent political figure, providing young Manuel with opportunities that most could only dream of. The Pardo family wasn't just wealthy. They were connected, influential, and seemingly destined for greatness. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Despite this privileged upbringing, something was fundamentally different about young Manuel. Those who knew him described him as intelligent and charismatic, traits that would serve him well in his future endeavors. But beneath that charm lay something more sinister. A rigid, uncompromising worldview that divided humanity into stark categories of good and evil. Picture a young man attending elite private schools, excelling academically, and displaying natural leadership qualities. Yet even then, teachers and classmates noticed his confrontational attitude when challenged, his inability to see shades of gray in moral situations. This wasn't typical teenage rebellion. This was the formation of a mindset that would later justify the unthinkable. Pardo's fascination with authority began early. He was drawn to military-style programs and physical fitness regimes that emphasized structure and control. This wasn't unusual for a young man of his generation, but for Pardo, it represented something deeper, a hunger for power over others, disguised as a desire to serve. The pressure of living up to his family's expectations may have contributed to his developing psychology. When you're raised in an environment where moral absolutes are preached and compromise is seen as weakness, what happens when the real world doesn't conform to those rigid standards? For Manuel Pardo, this question would have deadly consequences. After high school, Pardo enlisted in the military, seeking the discipline and hierarchy he craved. But his military service was brief and unremarkable, a stepping stone rather than a calling. It was here that he began to understand the intoxicating nature of legitimate authority, the feeling of having life and death power over others. This experience would plant the seeds for his later transformation from protector to predator. The late 1970s found Manuel Pardo joining the Broward County Police Department in Florida during one of the most turbulent periods in the region's history. South Florida was ground zero for the cocaine epidemic, with Miami serving as the primary entry point for Colombian cartels flooding America with drugs. The streets were war zones, and police officers found themselves outgunned and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. For Pardo, this environment was both a perfect match and a catastrophic misfit. Here was a man who thrived on confrontation, who saw the world in black and white, suddenly thrust into a gray area where corruption was rampant and the lines between good guys and bad guys were increasingly blurred. He approached policing with the fervor of a crusader, viewing himself as a warrior against the drug epidemic that was destroying his community. But Pardo's methods were extreme, even by the standards of 1980s Florida law enforcement. His colleagues described him as uncompromising to the point of recklessness. He couldn't tolerate what he perceived as weakness or corruption, not just among criminals, but within his own department. This rigid moral stance put him at odds with superiors who expected officers to follow protocol and work within the established chain of command. His specialty became undercover work targeting drug dealers and smugglers. Pardo excelled in these dangerous assignments, willing to put himself in harm's way to make arrests. But his success came with a cost. He began to blur ethical boundaries, using methods that raised serious questions about his judgment and temperament. The adrenaline rush of direct confrontation with dangerous criminals seemed to feed something dark within him. Imagine the frustration Pardo must have felt watching arrested dealers walk free on technicalities, seeing corruption within his own ranks, witnessing the revolving door of a justice system that seemed powerless against the tide of drugs and violence. For most officers, this frustration led to cynicism or career changes. For Pardo, it led to a much darker conclusion, that he would have to take matters into his own hands. The end came in 1983, just a few years into his career. Official records cite insubordination and failure to follow departmental policies as the reasons for his dismissal. But the real story was much deeper. Here was a man whose personal crusade had become incompatible with the institutional framework of modern policing. His superiors saw him not as a dedicated officer, but as a dangerous loose cannon who posed a threat to public safety and departmental integrity. The day Pardo turned in his badge marked a crucial turning point. The system he had believed in, the institution he had hoped to reform from within, had rejected him. In his mind, this wasn't a failure on his part. It was proof that the entire system was corrupt and weak. If legitimate law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't do what was necessary, then Manuel Pardo would create his own version of justice. The transformation from dismissed police officer to vigilante killer didn't happen overnight. After losing his badge in 1983, Pardo spent time developing his personal philosophy of justice, a twisted ideology that would soon turn deadly. By 1986, his disillusionment had crystallized into something terrifying, the belief that he had not just the right, but the duty to eliminate those he deemed unworthy of life. What made Pardo's killing spree particularly chilling was its calculated nature. This wasn't a crime of passion or a psychological breakdown. It was a methodical campaign of execution carried out with military precision. Between January and April of 1986, Pardo murdered 9 people in Miami-Dade County, each killing revealing his meticulous approach to what he considered righteous work. His target selection was deliberate and ideologically driven. Every victim was connected to the drug trade. Dealers, distributors, or associates in the narcotics world that Pardo believed was poisoning society. He didn't choose victims randomly or for personal gain. Instead, he conducted surveillance, studied their routines, and planned each murder with the same attention to detail he had once applied to police investigations. The execution method was terrifyingly consistent. Close-range shootings, often multiple shots to ensure death. His knowledge of police procedures helped him avoid detection, selecting locations and times that minimized witness exposure. Dimly lit parking lots, isolated streets, the interiors of vehicles. Pardo chose his killing grounds with tactical precision, always ensuring escape routes were planned and the risk of capture was minimal. But perhaps most disturbing was the pride Pardo took in his work. He maintained detailed records of his activities, including a diary that cataloged not just the murders, but the ideological justifications for each killing. In his mind, he wasn't committing crimes. He was conducting a military operation to cleanse society of its parasitic elements. One case exemplifies the cold calculation behind his actions. Victim shot 13 times, ensuring not just death, but making a statement about the thoroughness of his conviction. This wasn't about quick elimination. It was about sending a message, even if that message was only fully understood by Pardo himself. The money and drugs he took from victims weren't trophies in the conventional sense. Pardo kept only what he needed to fund his mission, purchasing weapons and ammunition, maintaining his equipment, sustaining his one-man war against what he saw as societal decay. This wasn't about personal enrichment. It was about resource allocation for a larger campaign. Perhaps most chillingly, Pardo's diary entries revealed a man who genuinely believed he was serving his country. Each murder was framed not as a crime, but as a patriotic duty. He saw himself as doing what law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't do, permanently removing dangerous elements from society. In his twisted logic, every bullet fired was a blow struck for justice and order. The discovery of Nazi paraphernalia in his home added another layer to this horrifying picture. Pardo's ideology wasn't just about vigilante justice. It was about racial and social superiority, about the elimination of undesirable elements from society. Even his dog bore a swastika tattoo, testament to how completely his extremist beliefs had consumed his life. For 4 months, Manuel Pardo operated as judge, jury, and executioner on the streets of Miami, leaving a trail of bodies and a community living in fear. His victims never knew they had been marked for death by a man who genuinely believed he was making the world a better place, one murder at a time. Ironically, the same meticulous attention to detail that made Manuel Pardo an effective killer ultimately led to his downfall. His compulsive need to document his activities, a trait perhaps rooted in his law enforcement background, would provide investigators with a roadmap to his crimes. The investigation that would bring down Pardo began with pattern recognition. Detectives noticed disturbing similarities between multiple murder cases. All victims were connected to the drug trade. Most had been killed execution style with multiple gunshots, and there was evidence of robbery at each scene. But it was the discovery of stolen items from several victims in Pardo's possession that first put him on law enforcement's radar. In May 1986, following leads from robbery victims who had survived encounters with their attacker, police obtained a search warrant for Pardo's home. What they found exceeded their worst expectations: a detailed diary that not only documented each of the 9 murders, but provided dates, names, and most disturbingly, Pardo's personal justifications for each killing. This wasn't the scattered notes of a disorganized criminal. It was a comprehensive record kept by someone who viewed his actions as historical events worthy of documentation. Each entry revealed Pardo's conviction that he was performing a necessary service, eliminating scum and drug dealers who threatened society. The diary read like military reports, clinical and detailed, showing no remorse or doubt about the righteousness of his mission. When confronted with this evidence, Pardo didn't deny his actions or attempt to minimize his role. Instead, he openly confessed to the murders, expressing pride rather than shame. From the moment of his arrest, he maintained that he was a soldier who had completed his mission. There was no plea bargaining, no attempt to shift blame. Pardo owned his actions completely. But the legal system wasn't prepared to simply accept Pardo's self-characterization as a righteous warrior. The question wasn't whether he had committed the murders. His confession and the overwhelming evidence made that clear. The real legal battle would center on his mental state at the time of the killings and whether he could be held fully responsible for his actions. The case that emerged from his confession would challenge fundamental assumptions about sanity, justice, and the death penalty. Here was a man who clearly understood the physical consequences of his actions. He knew that shooting people would kill them. But did he understand the moral and legal wrongfulness of murder? This question would determine whether Manuel Pardo would face execution or spend his life in a psychiatric facility. As news of his arrest spread, the full scope of Pardo's ideology became public knowledge. The Nazi memorabilia, the extremist beliefs, the cold calculation behind each murder, all of it painted a picture of a man whose commitment to his twisted vision of justice was absolute and terrifying. The courtroom became a battlefield not just over Manuel Pardo's guilt, which was never in question, but over the fundamental nature of evil itself. When his trial began, the central question wasn't what he had done, but why he had done it and whether he could be held fully accountable for actions he genuinely believed were righteous. Pardo's defense team faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend a client who openly admits to 9 murders and expresses pride in his actions? Their strategy focused on mental health, arguing that despite his apparent lucidity, Pardo was legally insane at the time of the killings. This wasn't about denying the murders. It was about arguing that Pardo's distorted worldview made him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Dr. Civil Marquette, a psychiatrist testifying for the defense, argued that while Pardo understood the physical consequences of his actions, he was unable to recognize their moral wrongfulness. According to Marquette's assessment, Pardo's rigid black-and-white thinking and his delusional sense of righteousness rendered him legally insane during the commission of the murders. In essence, the defense argued, Pardo lived in a reality so distorted that murder seemed not just acceptable, but morally imperative. The prosecution's response was swift and devastating. Their court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Leonard Haber, rejected the insanity defense entirely, describing Pardo in terms that would echo through criminal justice circles for years to come. Sane, but evil. Haber's assessment painted a picture of a calculating killer who fully understood the wrongfulness of his actions, but chose to commit them anyway, driven by extremist ideology rather than mental illness. This distinction, sane but evil, became central to the prosecution's case. They argued that Pardo's careful planning, his methodical execution of the murders, and his detailed record-keeping all demonstrated not mental illness, but cold-blooded calculation. His ability to evade capture for months, to select targets strategically, and to operate with tactical precision showed a mind that was disturbed but fully functional. Pardo himself seemed to relish the attention and the opportunity to justify his actions publicly. He showed open contempt for the psychological evaluations, reportedly calling the mental health experts whores who could be bought to say anything. His demeanor in court was defiant and unrepentant, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that he was a dangerous extremist rather than a mentally ill individual deserving of treatment. The trial took a particularly dark turn when details of Pardo's ideological beliefs became public. The Nazi paraphernalia found in his home wasn't just evidence of his extremism, it provided context for his actions. This wasn't just vigilantism. It was a campaign rooted in beliefs about racial and social superiority, about the right of certain people to determine who deserved to live or die. After 6 hours of deliberation, a remarkably short time for such a complex case, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. 9 murder convictions, multiple robbery charges, and weapons violations. The message was clear. Whatever Pardo's motivations, society would not accept his self-appointed role as judge, jury, and executioner. The sentencing phase provided Pardo with one final opportunity to address the court and perhaps show some remorse for his actions. Instead, he remained defiant to the end, telling the court, "I am a soldier. I accomplished my mission," and asking the jury to grant him the glory of ending my life. It was a statement that perfectly encapsulated his twisted worldview. Even facing execution, he saw himself as a warrior deserving of honor rather than a criminal facing justice. The jury obliged his request, recommending the death penalty for each of the 9 murders. Judge Philip Knight agreed, formally sentencing Pardo to 9 death sentences plus additional prison time. It was one of the most comprehensive death sentences in Florida history, reflecting not just the number of victims, but the calculated nature of the crimes. The automatic appeals process that followed Pardo's conviction became a window into the complex legal and ethical questions surrounding capital punishment, mental illness, and extremist ideology. For nearly a decade, Pardo's case wound its way through the court system, with each appeal raising fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and the nature of evil. Public defender Kellyanne Lance, leading Pardo's appeals, continued to argue that his extreme beliefs and emotional detachment were signs of serious psychological disturbance that should preclude execution. The defense painted a picture of a man so consumed by ideology that he had lost touch with moral reality, making him legally insane regardless of his tactical competence. But Assistant Attorney General Ralph Barrera countered with a chilling assessment of Pardo's true nature. He argued that Pardo was a cold-blooded killer who not only understood his actions, but took pleasure in them. The careful planning, the calm demeanor, the pride in the murders, all of these pointed not to mental illness, but to a calculating predator who had chosen evil over good with full knowledge of the consequences. The appeals process revealed disturbing details about Pardo's time on death row. Far from showing remorse or experiencing a change of heart, he remained convinced of the righteousness of his actions. Guards reported that he continued to express pride in his mission and showed no empathy for his victims or their families. This wasn't a man wrestling with guilt or seeking redemption. This was someone who believed, right up to the end, that he had done the right thing. On March 6, 1990, the Florida Supreme Court upheld both Pardo's conviction and his death sentence. The justices agreed with the lower court's assessment that Pardo was sane and fully accountable for his actions. They rejected the argument that his extremist beliefs constituted legal insanity, ruling that ideological motivation, however twisted, was not the same as mental illness. The court's decision reflected a broader legal principle, that society cannot excuse murder simply because the perpetrator believes their actions are justified. If ideological conviction could serve as a defense for killing, it would open the door for every terrorist, extremist, and vigilante to claim immunity from prosecution. The law must draw clear lines about what constitutes acceptable behavior, regardless of the actor's personal beliefs about right and wrong. When the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Pardo's case in 1991, it marked the end of his legal appeals. All avenues for challenging his conviction and sentence had been exhausted. The message from the highest levels of the American legal system was clear. Manuel Pardo would face execution for his crimes. Throughout this entire appeals process, Pardo remained consistent in his stance. He never begged for mercy, never expressed regret, never acknowledged that his victims were anything other than criminals who deserved to die. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer awaiting execution. He was a soldier who had completed his mission and was prepared to face the consequences with honor. This unwavering conviction in the face of death raises disturbing questions about the nature of extremist belief. How does someone become so certain of their righteousness that they can commit multiple murders without doubt or remorse? What combination of ideology, psychology, and circumstance creates a person capable of such calculated evil while maintaining a sense of moral superiority? Nearly 2 decades after his sentencing, Manuel Pardo Jr. was transported to Florida State Prison in Stark for his date with death. The lengthy delay reflected the complex appeals process common in capital cases, but it also meant that Pardo had spent years contemplating his fate while never wavering from his conviction that his actions had been justified. The method chosen for Pardo's execution was lethal injection, a procedure adopted by Florida in the 1980s as a more humane alternative to the electric chair. The process involves the sequential administration of 3 drugs. First, an anesthetic to induce unconsciousness. Second, a paralytic agent to stop breathing. And finally, potassium chloride to stop the heart. The entire procedure is designed to minimize pain while ensuring a swift clinical death. On the day of his execution, witnesses described Pardo as calm and composed, showing none of the anxiety or remorse that might be expected from someone facing their final moments. His demeanor was consistent with the persona he had maintained throughout his trial and appeals, a man convinced that he had served a righteous cause and was prepared to face the consequences with dignity. The witnesses to Pardo's execution included prison officials, media representatives, family members of victims, and legal observers, a diverse group gathered to witness the state's ultimate sanction being carried out. For the families of Pardo's victims, this moment represented closure after years of waiting for justice. For others, it raised questions about whether executing a man with such extreme beliefs served justice or simply perpetuated a cycle of violence. The procedure itself was completed within minutes, following protocols designed to ensure both efficiency and humanity. Medical personnel monitored Pardo's vital signs closely, confirming death once his heart stopped and brain activity ceased. Whatever final thoughts passed through his mind in those last moments went with him to the grave, along with any possibility of remorse or revelation about his crimes. But Pardo's execution didn't end the debates his case had sparked. Questions about the death penalty's effectiveness, the nature of extremist ideology, and the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility continued to resonate long after his death. His case became a touchstone for discussions about vigilantism, the limits of ideological belief as a criminal defense, and the challenge of dealing with offenders who genuinely believe their crimes are virtuous. The finality of execution meant that society would never have to worry about Manuel Pardo killing again, but it also meant that the opportunity to study and understand his psychology was lost forever. Some argued that keeping him alive might have provided insights into the development of extremist thinking that could help prevent similar cases in the future. For the victims' families, however, such academic considerations paled beside the need for justice and closure. These were real people with real lives who had been cut down by a man who appointed himself their judge and executioner. Whatever complex psychological or ideological factors contributed to Pardo's crimes, the bottom line remained simple. 9 innocent people were dead, and the man responsible had paid the ultimate price for his actions. The execution of Manuel Pardo marked the end of his personal story, but the beginning of his legacy as one of America's most disturbing criminal cases. His story continues to resonate because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about justice, morality, and the thin line between law enforcement and criminality. What makes Pardo's case particularly unsettling is how it inverts our traditional understanding of good and evil. Here was a man with law enforcement training, military background, and privileged upbringing, someone who should have been a pillar of society. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about how quickly noble ideals can be corrupted into something monstrous. The case raises uncomfortable questions about vigilantism that remain relevant today. In an era of widespread distrust in institutions and growing social division, Pardo's story serves as a warning about what happens when individuals decide to take the law into their own hands. His transformation from police officer to serial killer illustrates how easily the desire for justice can become a hunger for vengeance. Perhaps most disturbing is how Pardo's crimes were motivated not by traditional criminal impulses, greed, lust, or psychological compulsion, but by a twisted sense of moral duty. He genuinely believed he was making the world a better place by eliminating people he deemed unworthy of life. This ideological motivation makes his crimes particularly chilling because it demonstrates how dangerous true believers can become when they lose sight of legal and moral boundaries. The case also highlights the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. While Pardo's actions were clearly the product of disturbed thinking, the courts ultimately determined that his ability to plan and execute his crimes demonstrated legal sanity. This distinction between psychological disturbance and legal insanity continues to challenge the justice system in cases involving ideologically motivated violence. For law enforcement, Pardo's case serves as a reminder of the importance of psychological screening and ongoing mental health support for officers. The stress of police work, combined with regular exposure to violence and corruption, can take a devastating toll on officers' mental health. Pardo's case demonstrates what can happen when these pressures combine with pre-existing psychological problems and extremist beliefs. The investigation and prosecution of Pardo also showcased both the strengths and limitations of the criminal justice system. His meticulous record-keeping provided investigators with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. But the lengthy appeals process meant that justice was delayed for nearly 2 decades. This tension between due process and timely resolution continues to challenge the death penalty system today. Perhaps most importantly, Pardo's case serves as a reminder that evil can wear many faces. He wasn't an obvious monster or social outcast. He was an educated, articulate man with law enforcement training and a privileged background. His ability to function normally while planning and executing multiple murders challenges our comfortable assumptions about who is capable of such crimes. The story of Manuel Pardo Jr. remains one of the most chilling examples of how ideology can corrupt and how power can be abused. His transformation from protector to predator serves as a permanent reminder that the distance between justice and vengeance, between law and lawlessness, can sometimes be measured in a single twisted decision. Today, as we face new challenges from extremist ideologies and vigilante justice, the lessons from Manuel Pardo's case remain as relevant as ever. His story is a stark reminder that in a civilized society, justice must be administered by institutions accountable to the people, not by individuals accountable only to their own warped moral codes. The case of Manuel Pardo Jr. is a chilling study in how conviction can become cruelty. From a Florida upbringing to his final days on death row, Pardo's journey, police officer turned self-styled executioner, cost 9 people their lives and left a community scarred. What makes it worse than the violence is the certainty. He believed killing was a moral duty. That descent from protector to predator shows how easily justice becomes vengeance when carried out according to one person's warped code. Think you know how it ends? There are details in this case that still surprise and unsettle. For the full uncut story and bonus interviews, download the Scoob app now to get access to the full story. Thanks for listening to Dark Justice. Subscribe, leave a review, and share if this episode stayed with you. Until next time, remember the line between justice and revenge is razor thin.